Hello, welcome to this course on the Holocaust at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. My name is Dr. Kurt Borchardt. I'll be your instructor for the term. And what I wanted to do first was to talk with you a little bit about how a course such as this might begin. There are a lot of different possibilities. Some people would say perhaps you could start with something like World War I. You could start with the Versailles Treaty, for example. Others might say, well, how about Hitler's role in the Holocaust? How about his biography? Some people might argue that you could start earlier with the creation of the German state, and perhaps others might say you can go much farther back to Judaism and the beginning of Judaism and its development as important to understand what happened to Jews who were one of the primary targets during the Holocaust. So this question of where should we begin is an important one and something that no professor will answer in the same way. So I've made some decisions and I wanted to talk with you about those and some of the possibilities for what we'll do this term. One of the things, though, I'd like to first start off with would be, what are some of the different names that you could assign to the Holocaust or things that are similar to the Holocaust? Here are some ideas, and your text might fill these in a bit. One of them is the Holocaust itself, but we need to remember that this was a term that was created after the event. And so as what we now know as the Holocaust was unfolding, people didn't run around saying, oh no, look, this is the Holocaust. You don't necessarily have a name for something in history until it's unfolded. So a good example might be what we refer to as the Middle Ages in Europe. It wasn't as if people during the Middle Ages said, well, okay, we're in the Middle Ages. You know, we're between this Greek and Roman period of rationality and science, and we're moving into the Enlightenment, so that's in the middle. They didn't know, right? So the Holocaust itself, which in Greek means burnt offering, has a particular connotation, and that connotation can be a religious connotation, and something that perhaps people don't find very agreeable, especially Jews. The idea that they might be considered a sacrifice might not be very appealing. So there are other names that are preferable for Jews, sometimes given to the Holocaust, such as Shoah, S-H-O-A-H, Churban, which I believe is also in your book. Sometimes this has been referred to as the catastrophe. You could also talk about how this term overlaps with other types of things, like, for example, the idea of genocide. Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide in response to the Holocaust, and it means the murder of a culture. So you can talk about the extent to which the Holocaust parallels that idea. We could also talk about ethnic cleansing, which is a more recent term that's been developed, especially with the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, former Yugoslavia, and how certain groups of people were removed. You could say it was a euphemism for trying to get rid of groups of people. So there are a lot of different possible terms that people can use to describe an event like the Holocaust. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that each one, what does each connote here is what I have in the overhead. Each one involves a particular focal point, a perspective. The name that's given to something is important because it also indicates a source of power. You know, who gets to define what something is and what the name of something is. So I'd like you to keep that in mind when you're reading the beginning portions of the text, especially parts of the world must know, because this is an event that was unfolding and something that different groups define it differently. Now, let me return to some other things about starting a course, because you could make an argument that there are possibly at least two types of courses you could have. One would be a memorialization of people who were victimized or targeted. So a course like that might strongly emphasize the perspective of those individuals who suffered, who were hurt and disparaged during this event. So what would be the value of that? Well, one thing for sure is it's commemorative. It allows for those people who were injured and oppressed to be remembered. So one thing you could start with would be something like, what were their characteristics? What would the people who were targeted, what would life be like for them? How would they live? What were the names of their collectives or groups? And, what were their practices, their faith, their history, culture, language, beliefs? So that's captured in the second bullet point here. How did they live? And it's very, very important, I think, to consider groups like Jews, gypsies, gay people as unique entities that have some of these elements of a certain kind of perspective, language, set of beliefs, sets of experiences. And to note what those are, because the first thing I'd like to emphasize with the Holocaust is it's about people. And in particular, one Holocaust survivor told me it's about what people can do to other people. Okay, so some background on those people. The next good question would be, how did they learn about the Holocaust? So how did they see this event unfolding? What did they hear from people around them? What did they hear officially from the government? How did they not only get information but make sense of it? So if, for example, they received postcards from people who were at Auschwitz telling them that this is just a camp and they shouldn't be afraid, how might that influence their decisions? How might their decisions be influenced by other things, like, for example, not fully knowing what was going on, the patterns of deception which were involved in the Holocaust? How were they involved? What types of things happened to those targets? Because various targets had different laws and persecution applied to them in different ways. Also, too, it happened in very different places. So how did that play out historically? What was the logic of and rationale for their actions? You can make a pretty strong case that people try to understand events as they unfold, and if we look back on things with 2020 hindsight, it becomes easy to blame. So, for example, people often say things like, well, why didn't Jews simply leave when they found out that this event was occurring that would end up killing 6 million Jews? Well, in point of fact, we don't have that information if you were living in that particular point in history. It's unfolding, and there was a lot of deception involved in the way policy was being presented by Nazis to the general public. So that relates to the final bullet point. How did they understand what was happening? What was the way that they got information, again? How did they think about their long-term future as opposed to maybe short-term aspects, and what could happen to them versus what they had to lose? If, say, for example, they left Germany, they had to give up all their property and they had to pay a fine. So these kinds of things would influence what types of actions people would do and how they would understand the events unfolding. Another way of thinking about the Holocaust and how you could start a semester on it would be to consider the perpetrator's perspective, the people who were enacting this event, and what were they like, what were they thinking. So you could focus on perpetrators first, and you could do an entire course on perpetrators. So what were their characteristics? How do we differentiate between, say, for example, people who were perpetrators, but also those maybe who were collaborators, right? Who helped with the process. Not everybody had this direct Nazi lineage that was involved in this event, but also what were their characteristics? What type of culture did they come from? What were some of the ideas stressed by that culture? How did a certain way of framing their culture as maybe the best or the one to be thought of as most important, how did that influence their worldview? So things like, what's the history of their culture, perspectives, language, beliefs, experiences? It involved multiple cultures, this event that we'll consider all term. And so If you talk about German culture, the language, what types of beliefs were being held, the experiences that Germans had at the time, the feelings that they had toward other groups, and the fact that the world was in a state of great flux as this event was happening. So a great war had just unfolded, what people thought of as the First World War. Didn't know for sure that they would make it through. So how did this frame German experience? And also, too, you can consider Polish experience. The death camps were all in Poland, the 6 death camps. And so what were the conditions in Poland like that allowed for those death camps to be located there? How did the perpetrators learn about the Holocaust? Because this wasn't an even learning curve. You have people who are at different points of the process who are learning about what's happening in real time. And there was not initially a policy in 1933, which is the starting point for the Holocaust, as we'll define it in this course. 1933, the Nazis came to power. They did not have a clear agenda at that point to kill every last Jew in Europe. So policy unfolded gradually, and the way that people developed and enacted that policy changed over time. So how do individuals learn about this? How were they involved in the Holocaust? You have these so-called desk murderers who were not killing anyone physically face to face, but for example made the trains run on time, right? A very important thing if you're involved in deportations. Did they see themselves as active participants, or did they see themselves in a more passive way? One of the books that I'll be using this term is Into That Darkness, Gita Sarini's masterpiece, really about Franz Stangl and this commandant who was held responsible for killing 900,000 people ultimately. What was his role, and how did he see himself performing his tasks? What was the logic and rationale for his actions? What were the logic and rationales for other people who might have more peripheral involvement? Why did they do what they do? Did they have something to lose? Did they feel pressure? Did they have ideologies they were following, or was it more just something they did to advance in their career? Which is a fascinating question we'll ask this term. And how did they understand what was happening? At one point there were euphemisms like the final solution, which didn't necessarily seem to be about mass murder. There was also evacuation to the east as a euphemism. So an evacuation sounds like you're saving groups of people. Again, this is a very complex topic, and what I want to stress to you is that complex events, like the Holocaust, have complex origins. There will be no simple answers in the course. Our goal is to explore the complexity of the Holocaust itself. Let me also consider a few things about language and terms. Important things to note. The Holocaust itself, with a capital H, refers to a proper noun. And a proper noun is something that's to be capitalized. It's a designated thing that exists. So for example, World War II, you would capitalize the W's because that's a thing in history that has its own dimensions and aspects, right? The Civil War, you would capitalize C and W, right? So a capital H Holocaust refers to a specific event during a particular time. It ran from 1933 to 1945 in Europe, and it involved many different countries, and it involved the systematic targeting and mass murder of 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews. This was a mass murder that was perpetrated by a particular country and involved the resources being directed, all the resources of one state being put toward that task. So this is something to consider as a capital H noun. A small h is what's used for, as I say here, any mass destruction of people. So you could refer to a Holocaust as something like, for example, what happened in Cambodia under the rule of Pol Pot. That might be called a Holocaust with a small h, But I'd like you to note that that's very different from the proper noun we'll use through this term, and I expect you to use when you refer to the Holocaust. There's a question, too, of how much overlap are there between some concepts. Nazi, for example, versus German. Some people think of them as synonyms, and I don't. I think of Nazis as people who followed a particular political agenda and abided by a particular ideology. Germans may have been Nazis, but not necessarily, and it's important to think through these things in a complex way. So the question, are they the same? Are they interchangeable? And to what extent are they overlapping or are perhaps separate? Because sometimes one might be conflated with the other, and it's important to use the correct terms. Another controversy we'll consider the idea of how do you even spell something like the term anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism as one word with capital A versus anti-Semitism with a hyphen in the middle. Here's the issue with that. The term Semite refers to a language group. So, for example, Middle Eastern languages, that's a language group which is Semitic, right? And so the scholar Doris Bergen out of the University of Toronto makes an argument that the term anti-Semitism there is a misnomer. It's misleading because it really means the hatred of Jews, but because of the way that that hyphen works, it looks as though it's about a hatred of a group of people speaking a language. That's why she uses this preferred term for her, anti-Semitism, because that specifically refers to hatred of Jews. Okay, so that's one issue. Here's another thing. When you do spell check on computer, sometimes it will automatically change things for you. So even the nuances of something like a hyphen can become important to scholars and something to consider while you're reading different texts. Also, too, regarding language, we can consider the idea of euphemisms. A euphemism, what is it? It's a word that stands in place for another word. Maybe it's a little less harsh. Here's an example. If somebody talks about the Holocaust, that would seem to indicate this mass murder, as I said, of 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews in Europe between 1933 and 1945. If you talk about, for example, the final solution to the Jewish question, that was the phrase that was propagated by Hitler and many Nazis during this period. It doesn't sound like mass murder. It sounds like a solution to a problem. And that is a completely different framing from the idea of something understood after the fact as a state using all of its resources, deploying all of its resources to kill every last Jew in Europe. So euphemisms can be very useful for people who want to gloss over the negative aspects of what they're doing. For example, during the mass shootings and burying of corpses, sometimes Nazis and their collaborators would refer to bodies as wood or figures or dolls, because those are not things that had a life, they didn't have families, and so it was easier to deal with some of those types of things in language. Also, too, I mentioned in the previous slide the idea of evacuation to the east. That makes it seem like something positive may be happening as opposed to something which resulted in death. So we're going to consider a lot of these euphemisms through the course of the semester because they're crucial for understanding how sometimes people can make social distance between themselves and some really horrific actions and activities. Another consideration at the beginning of this course would be, why might we want to study the Holocaust? And you might come into this with many different ideas and questions. I've listened to students over many years, and one of the things that people have talked about was people think of this as something you can learn lessons from. And that's something we'll discuss. There's a question of, to what extent does the Holocaust overlap with other genocides and might be seen as a template for the mass destruction of people? So people think of it in terms of learning lessons, especially that phrase, we don't want history to repeat itself, notion of George Santayana. And those, again, are valid, legitimate reasons for looking into it. Some people argue, too, that phrase, never again. We don't ever want to see this. Another reason for studying the Holocaust, as I mentioned before, might be to commemorate, to memorialize, to take into account victims, targets, what they experienced, and to validate their lives and their experience through this horrific event. Sometimes people want to take a course on the Holocaust, or think that a course on the Holocaust ought to emphasize how one man, Hitler, presumably came to lead an entire nation to this horrific event. And I'm going to unpack that and interrogate that, because in fact it isn't all about one man, but people do like to consider the biography and the role of Hitler in the Holocaust, and he's certainly a key figure, but there are a lot of other dimensions to consider with this. And the final thing I'll note for you is a reason to study the Holocaust, but it's one that people don't often think as much about, is this idea of Holocaust denial. And this is a brief little article which you could look at if you like, at least the first part, which is about a leader of Iran in 2009. His name is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and he argued that the Holocaust did not happen. And so a great reason for studying and trying to understand the Holocaust is that you will, from this point forward, know facts and information about an event that some people don't believe occurred. And knowledge is power, and facts and information are power to dispel such myths. Now, in these last two slides, I want to talk with you briefly about the Jewish people, and then we'll continue more in future slides about the experience of Jews historically. I've created something that's very broad brush, and you could argue pretty vulgar, but it should help us to navigate the course and understand a little bit about identity and how it played out during the Holocaust and before the Holocaust, and to some extent today. There's this question of who are Jewish people? Let me start by saying Jews were not the only people targeted during this horrific event. There were also gypsies, or what are formally referred to a group of people known as Roma and Sinti. Gay people were targeted. Handicapped or disabled people were targeted. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted. And a group called the Rhineland Bastards were also targeted. Freemasons, several different groups of people, Soviet POWs, were also victimized during the Holocaust. I'm focusing right now on Jewish people because there was a concentrated effort by, again, the state of Germany to eliminate every last Jew in Europe during the period of 1933 to 1945. So that means that this group of people are central to understanding the event. It's not to say that one group of victims were more worthy of study than another. Death is death is death, and it's all horrific. But in order to understand this, we're going to go through a little more of the history, and I'd like to start by considering some ways to think about Jewish people and Judaism. The first one, Jews can be considered a religious group. Obviously, Jews practice Judaism, and it's a Jewish faith. So they follow the faith, they practice it. They read the Torah, they engage in religious ceremonies, they follow the precepts of law in order to feel that they are Jews and be considered by others as Jews. Some things that are important here would be the mother's status, because if you are born to a Jewish mother, then you're considered automatically Jewish. If you are born to a Jewish father, Orthodox Jews would not necessarily consider you Jewish. And so there are ways of parsing out who counts in a given faith. And those things involve the status of the mother or the father, whether or not someone has gone through a conversion ceremony otherwise. You have the idea of bar or bat mitzvahs, and that is a particular ceremony that happens when a young person is entering into adulthood, and they claim to be responsible for their faith. They recite things from the Torah, prayers, and this confirms their status as an adult Jew. Conversion I have here also is important to the idea of identity. People can convert to different religions. And so that is a rough way of explaining that Judaism involves religion and can be considered a religious grouping. Okay. Second idea with Jewish identity is as a cultural group. And cultural groups are not necessarily religious. There can be other aspects of culture. So for example, these are people who may not be following religious practices, and in particular, may not be the most devout. They may have things that they don't do at all, or they just consider themselves to be Jewish. They may speak Hebrew, they may speak Yiddish, they may have family background as a Jewish family and a historical sense of connection. So they self-identify, feel ties to other Jews. And this notion of secular Jews can fall under this category. So some people would say that's an oxymoron. You can't be secular if you're Jewish. Others would say, well, I follow certain kinds of patterns and practices, and some people joke that they're Jewish TTAY, which would be Jewish 3 times a year. They go to the high holy days and they celebrate in that way. So this is another way of considering what counts as a Jewish person. The third one I'm going to mention here is the notion of a racial group, and you'll see that I have it in quotation marks. So this was, as I say here, kind of more Hitler's perspective. But there are some Jews who think of themselves as having a certain biological inherited set of traits, genetic inheritance. So the focus with this is biology, and again, something that Hitler emphasized. Now, what I want to stress to you, though, is that race for sociologists is not considered biological. It is considered a social construction, which means we create the idea of race, where we selectively look at biological traits, like, say, hair color, facial features, skin color, and we select those biological traits, humans do, and assign them some kind of social meaning. Okay, you have these particular traits, we will consider you to be white or Caucasian. You have these traits, you'll be considered to be Native American. So in some very important respects, race is socially constructed and created by people. It does not exist as a biological entity per se. We make race real. And so you could make an argument, like many people do today, that we're living in a post-racial society. The idea of race is falling apart, right? There are people who claim multiple racial statuses and ethnicities. On the other hand, though, you should strongly consider the fact that race has a historical reality. And so, for example, it would be undeniable to say that the experience of African Americans is not very different, perhaps, than the experience of Polish Americans. So that's a racial group, and I mentioned Polish Americans, that would be an ethnic group. The idea is that you'd be silly to ignore the fact that race has real ramifications for people, even though we think that its importance is diminishing over time. So this idea of race as a way of thinking about Judaism, I want you to take that with a grain of salt. And it's something, though, that also plays out with the Jewish community. Some Jews believe that they are racially different than others. So the thing I want to note here at the bottom, there can be, and often may well be, overlap between these 3 sources of identification with Jewish people. And that overlap is for Jewish people themselves and how other people think of and identify who counts as Jewish. I want to end this set of slides on the note of considering complexity in terms of identity. And so I just went through a very vulgar description of how you might consider someone to be a Jew or not. These are ongoing debates that involve people in everyday life and also institutions. Like, for example, in Israel, you have to apply to be able to immigrate, and this is a Jewish state, so they are accepting people based on religion and their faith. However, I wanted to show you this article I found in the Jerusalem Post, which brings up some fascinating questions about how a person is to be identified. And in this case, there's some legal issues that are raised. And if you can zoom in on this slide, it might help you a bit. But it says removing stumbling blocks to Jewish identity. And the idea here is that there are people who are considering themselves Jewish and have always been traditionally practicing this faith, but may not have the records in order to verify and substantiate to an authority figure that they're Jewish in a proper kind of way. So it says here, if you go to Israel, many immigrants who claim to be Jewish have difficulty proving it to the satisfaction of the chief rabbinate because of a lack of reliable documentation. Okay, so there might be some people who would say, "Oh yeah, we are all of a similar origin, and I consider you to be Jewish," very informally. But then there are others who might say, "Well, no, we want documentation. We want certain kinds of certificates of particular ceremonies." Now, here's the fascinating part too. It says, Ketbot, or marriage contracts, have been largely non-existent among Russian Jews for over half a century. The result has often been that people who sincerely consider themselves Jewish, and may indeed be, cannot prove that fact, and then they're turned away from the official rabbinate when they want to be married. So the idea, it says, in Europe in the past was trust the default position. How do you prove that you're a Jew? Well, if someone says they are, then they are. But this is something that's debated and contested. So it says here, a brief survey of sources in Jewish law will show these current strictures were not always the norm. So how you size up who's a part of any racial, ethnic, sexual, other categories will depend a lot on who is doing the observing and who's being observed. It's like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. Okay, so we'll think about this, I hope, and you can keep this in mind throughout the term when you consider some of the ways that, for example, Nazis defined who counts as Jews, and the different power relations that are involved in any form of identification.